Thanks very much, Minister, for that really refreshing and direct and fact-based sort of exposition there. I particularly like the sort of balanced approach that you took, the whole of government response to these issues and the recognition of the compounding risks that we face, including through climate change. Daily we hear new evidence of the significance of climate change, both here in Australia and globally, and we need to be taking full account of that. So I really do appreciate that approach that you're adopting, and the very straightforward way in which you're approaching this, because I think we need to have honest talking and straightforward public debate about this really important issue. And that whole of government approach that you're taking, I think, is really crucial. And so it's a really crucial part of that is the National Emergency Management Agency. And it's a great pleasure to have Brendan Moon here today to speak with us about the activities that are being undertaken by NEMA. So Brendan is the first Coordinator General of NEMA. Previous to that, he was in the Queensland Reconstruction Authority, starting as General Manager of Operations in 2011, taking over as CEO in 2016. Brendan has been a major contributor to both national and international dialogue on disaster risk reduction, and he's presented, amongst other things, at many UN conferences on disaster risk reduction. So it's with great pleasure that I welcome Brendan to the floor here. Cheers, Brendan.
Thank you, Mark, and also good morning, Minister. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to all Torres Strait Islanders and Aboriginal people who join us here today. I pay my respects as well. My role today really is about prompting a conversation about where to next as a nation. To have a brief reflection essentially on what we've seen in the last couple of decades, but also to actually challenge you about where to next. And what I'd like to do firstly is to acknowledge Mark and the Institute for the wonderful work of bringing all of you together here. I remember 10 years ago when we'd have a forum such as this to start to talk about the future of our nation, about building resilience to our climate, to our weather systems, to a whole range of challenges we faced. It was very much centred in the response agencies and the recovery agencies. But now to see so many sectors that are a part of this conversation and contributing to our understanding of how we need to evolve as a nation and globally actually is really, really heartening. And I see many, many faces who are very, very familiar around the room today. So it's great to see you all again. I want to challenge you, as I said, as the Minister has touched on. I think it's important to get an understanding of what are the facts that sit behind what is sitting here, what is happening here in Australia. I'll also suggest that we need to debunk a couple of myths as well. And some of you during the Q&A might challenge me in terms of what my view is on a couple of those myths. And I welcome that because they're the important conversations we need to be having here. Now, I've got a video I want to show you, which is, it can be a little bit temperamental about where we've come in the last 15 years. And I'm sure all of you will reflect, given the scale and the size and the frequency of events that we've faced, where you were at a particular point in time. Because I think everyone who sits in this room today has been touched by some sort of natural disaster or dealt with a community or an individual who's recovering from the same. I'll try and get that to work. So I might get you to run that manually, Jerry, if you can. Next one, thanks. a snapshot of the last 15 years here in Australia. And I think over the last 5 years, it's fair to say that 4 out of 5 local government areas in this country have been impacted by some sort of event. And if we drill down and actually into some individual communities, especially in Western New South Wales, for example, some of those communities have been impacted 24 times over the course of the last 3 years. And there's some of the big challenges that we really face as we seek to invest in the thinking and also in the measures that we need to take into the future. How do we deal with legacy risk, where people have settled, where our townships are, where our infrastructure systems, how they are engineered? How do we deal as these events significantly challenge us every year? They cascade, they compound, and they become more complex. And I think from that last video, it's important to recognise that if we look at the rapid onset events that we experience here in Australia in our very active part of the South Pacific, but also recognise that climate change makes it fundamentally necessary to discard the notion that national scale crises occur infrequently. These do not happen every 5 years, every decade. These are happening on an annual basis now. And as Mark Howden indicated at the most recent board meeting at the Institute, which really gave me pause to think, is that tools that we have been using to deal with crises of the past will lose their efficacy in the face of climate change. So what are the steps? What are the investments? What are the structures that we need to have in place now to ensure that we can deal with a really challenging future? If I reflect on last season, for example, what started out as a fairly benign forecast, a La Nina, potentially El Nino event, rapidly escalated into systems that impacted us from bushfires in the Northern Territory, Western Australia, tropical cyclones, storms in Queensland, all the way through to Victoria. They were record-breaking events, 900 millimetres of rain overnight in northern Queensland that completely challenged the engineering standards by which we build our infrastructure, our communication networks, and the way our communities operate. If we looked in Victoria, for example, we had catastrophic bushfires one day, 24 hours later, major flooding in the same locality. Really, really challenging events. Over 600,000 households without power for weeks on end as a result of those particular events. And I think also the one thing that really, really stood out to me as a result of last year's events were that the communities that we assumed were very resilient were in fact, when they were challenged by those events, in terms of being connected, in terms of their services, infrastructure services, communications, their supply chains, completely challenged and broken down, where we had to do large-scale evacuations of communities, not only in Queensland, but also in the Northern Territory. We see insurance losses obviously mounting. We see the cost to the Australian taxpayer of all these events significantly challenging all of us. And so talking about the cost of those disasters, let's just have a look at the last 5 years if we can. And the thing that strikes me about these charts is over the last 5 years, the frequency of these events that have impacted us are relatively consistent. 40 or 50 big events during the course of the year. But the cost of those disasters absolutely increasing exponentially. And I think now if we look at the entire program now, just for Commonwealth, joint Commonwealth state funding under the disaster recovery funding arrangements, we are looking in the order of a program from the Black Summer bushfires, given that still there are communities in southeastern New South Wales through to Victoria recovering from the Black Summer bushfires, which were 5 years ago. That entire program now is some $24 billion. And if you look at the modelling done by Deloitte as part of their work, assisting in starting to define the problem that actually faces us, when you look at the indirect costs associated with those particular events, it's actually double that number. And so the forecast that we were starting to calibrate our systems with only 6 years ago suggested by 2050, the cost of disasters to the Australian economy would be in the order of $35 billion a year. The most recent forecast, it will be $70 billion a year. So doubling in 6 years. So these are some of the challenges as we make policy decisions, as we make investment decisions, as we make decisions about where we live into the future and what our systems need to be so that we can support our communities after a big event, needs to be informed by this is rapidly accelerating. Thanks, Mark. So where's recovery expenditure gone? And I think this is a hot topic in that my experience in the recovery space is we deal with a number of domains here. It's a very humbling space because everyone has a view on where expenditure should go. And what I'd like to do is just challenge you and suggest the myth that we should flip recovery expenditure to investment in risk reduction and resilience. I'd like to challenge you on that. We need a safety net for our communities. This should not be a binary choice. And I think if we look at any contemporary definition of what a resilient society or a resilient nation looks like, it is the ability to prepare, respond, recover, and adapt. So the notion that we would make a decision that we need to take investment out of supporting and having that safety net for our community so that we can rebuild after already baked in climate change impacts and the challenges about aging infrastructure and where we live just simply does not pass the pub test. And I think we need to move away from that conversation and have a more nuanced conversation guided by the facts. And that's certainly a big priority for the National Emergency Management Agencies and all the state organisations that we are dealing with, but also importantly, the not-for-profit sector, the private sector as well, is that we do need a scalable capacity to be able to respond and recover. And that actually goes to insurance as well, because insurance plays an enormous part in how we do respond and recover from these events. It's just not a risk mitigation measure as we see it. They play a much more important part of our emergency management system. So what are we doing? The dial is shifting here, and what is guiding us? It's the second National Action Plan. It's our commitment to Sendai. And when you look at the work that's going on in this risk reduction space, that's so intimately entwined with the work that's going on in response and recovery, it's about starting to inform those investments. It's about better understanding risk. And what I'd like to do is acknowledge Andrew Hall and the Insurance Council of Australia and all the insurers who were part of that conversation. As the Minister pointed out earlier, the insurers have a rich body of knowledge about the risk that we face now, but also into the future. And I'll talk a little bit in a minute about the work that's gone on in risk reduction investment. But you will see from a lot of that investment, it's been episodic at least. It has been in reaction to particular events. But the real risk is, as they say, generals fighting the last war. We need to get a better understanding of what we face into the future to start to guide those decisions and those choices that we face. Thanks, Mike. Second myth, the 97-3 myth. And I think all of us have heard it. It's a cute grab to a media interview or something like that, but we need to do more in the investment in the mitigation space. So Productivity Commission Review did a fantastic report back in 2015 about the state of funding for natural disasters here in Australia. And it pointed out there was only 3% going into risk reduction and also building resilience throughout the nation. That was 2015 using data sets derived from 2011 through to about 2014 as part of the report. Importantly, I would say this is not, I'm not being critical of the report because the report's guideposts and the recommendations are as relevant today as they were in 2015. But the dial has shifted. And I think we need to be having that conversation with people, with the various sectors. Why would we be telling the reinsurers globally that we're only investing 3% in resilience and risk reduction, when in fact it has changed considerably? Back in 2011 and 12, and I know there are a number of people here in the audience today and online who are working in this space there was one program, the National Disaster Resilience Program, approximately $50 million a year. Now there are over 18 programs that are actually starting to deal with those big challenges that we have spoken about, that are reducing risk, that are making communities more resilient. But I think it's fair to say, though, that many of the programs that were born here were born out of a reaction to a particular event. How do we turn that switch even, or the dial even further, so that we take a longer term view here? And that's why you are important in this conversation, so that you can start to paint that picture about what we need to do, about what future risk actually looks like, without letting go of the fact that we have settled where we have over the last few hundred years here in Australia. That our stock of buildings and our engineering standards need to evolve with the impacts of climate change. So there's some of the big challenges we need to grapple with here. And if I look at that mix of investment, it's funded a range of programs: structural mitigation, managed retreat, warning systems, coastal hazard mitigation. But as I said, there is a proportion of it that has been event-driven. If we're going to do anything, we need to refine that system so that we can start to prioritise what we really need to do into the future. So finally, what's NEMA doing about this? We work within a system, and many of you here are part of that system here. We work with the states very closely to ensure that we have the right people at the table. And as I said at the front end of my address, was that 10 years ago, it was response agencies, recovery agencies. It's a much broader church now, and we'll continue to ensure that the people's voices that need to be heard, the organisations that will inform investment, policy settings, capabilities into the future, are a part of that solution. We'll continue to build scalable capacities in response and recovery. And you've seen that additional investment in our firefighting capabilities, in our personnel capabilities, to start to build that ecosystem that we can respond and recover to large events anywhere here in Australia. Importantly, we need to work more closely with the private sector, as they have many of the solutions that we are looking for in government to guide policy, but also to start to craft what are those principles that need to inform investment into the future. And that's why the Hazard Insurance Partnership is so important to us. And then finally, we will continue to focus on investment in risk reduction, is to ensuring that our communities are safer. They are able to adapt to a changing climate. And that's the focus of the National Emergency Management Agency, is bringing all those parties together. It will involve some big challenges, some big choices, but we're certainly looking forward to that challenge and being a part of the conversation with yourselves. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Brendan, for that really nice little sort of coverage of what NEMA's doing, and that pretty scary map. Noting that one of those things that comes out of that map is clearly there are some places in Australia which are much, much better off being at in terms of disaster risks. And just as you leave, Minister, I just want to thank you again for coming here this morning and listening and participating in this. Now, one of the critical things that Brendan was identifying, and I should say, I'm Mark Howden. I'm the Director of Institute of Climate Energy and Disaster Solutions. Sorry for not introducing myself before. I plead jet lag. I just flew in from Europe on Sunday night. is one of the critical things is that increasing threat of climate change, building on all of those other things that the Minister talked about, and the increasing cost and increasing frequency of those disruptions from climate change. One of the crucial things that you mentioned there, Brendan, was that the clear summary of evidence from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was our existing approaches to adapting to climate change become less and less useful as climate change progresses. So that means we have both an increasing threat and a reduced capacity to deal with it. And that's why we have to take this issue really seriously. And it's great to see you doing that. In the face of that problem where we have our existing approaches incrementally applied to climate change become less and less useful, it means we need to think transformationally about solutions. And that's why it's with great pleasure that I introduce Roslyn Prinsley, Associate Professor Prinsley, here to talk about transformational solutions. So Roslyn heads up the disaster risk component of the institute that I lead. And she's got several projects which she's going to be talking about this morning. Prior to being at ICEDS, Roslyn was sitting in the central part of ANU, prior to that with the Department of Education and Training, and prior to that she was with the Office of the Chief Scientist, focusing on mathematics, education, etc. and STEM. So welcome, Roslyn.
Sorry, just getting set up. Sorry, on an angle. Thank you. Sorry, it's just not doing what it's supposed to. Maybe it go the other way around. Maybe I'll give up. No. Is it? Okay, put it down. Okay, sorry about that. We're just trying to look at a whiz way to actually set up my notes so I couldn't have to look down at them so much. So I'm going to explain to you today how transformational solutions will bring us much closer to reducing both the human and economic costs, as well as the environmental costs of climate-fueled disasters. Brendan emphasised the reality today of the cascading, compounding, and complex situation that we're facing. We've seen an ongoing rise in the severity of events and expenditure on recovery. And it is no coincidence that extreme events are the top global risk identified in the World Economic Forum's annual Global Risk Perception Survey. So it is very clear that the challenge before us right now are substantial. If we do nothing over the next 40 years, Deloitte predicts that the cumulative cost of natural disasters to the Australian economy is expected to be at least $1.35 trillion in present value terms. And this actually excludes what I think are some of the major costs. By 2030, we expect that riverine flooding will result in about 1 in 25 homes across Australia becoming uninsurable. This alone amounts to $414 billion. Around 250,000 residential buildings, valued at around $225 billion, are directly vulnerable to the impacts of coastal inundation, with a sea level rise of 1.1 metres. It could be more, but it could be less, we don't know. These are also uninsurable. Uninsurable ultimately becomes unlivable. If a house is uninsurable, this indicates it will undergo regular certain damage and owners will be left with properties that they cannot live in, afford to fix or sell. Land also becomes unsuitable for habitation due to frequent inundation. We also know that 5.6 million homes are at risk of bushfire damage, and most of these homes are not bushfire resilient. We can see these costs rising before our eyes as $11.4 billion was allocated in the Australian government's 24-25 budget to continue supporting ongoing recovery efforts, much needed ongoing recovery efforts, reflecting an increase of $3.9 billion from the 2023-24 mid-year economic and fiscal outlook. So who bears these costs? Well, obviously homeowners, local governments, state and federal governments, taxpayers, insurance companies, and those overwhelmed and overstretched charities, NGOs, and healthcare organisations, not to mention the environment. Climate change is outpacing our ability to adapt. We're facing a severe shortfall in funding for both recovery efforts and risk mitigation. Government resources are becoming increasingly strained and soon will be unable to meet growing demands. The gap in insurance protection is widening, leaving more people vulnerable. Our current approaches often address symptoms and not root causes of disaster risk. And we lack those transformational options to tackle the fundamental drivers of these challenges head on. So for those of you that can cope with conceptual graphs, I'm about to show you one. So what are the greatest disaster risks where? And I know people are working on this. Which measures where will reduce risk the most? And how much will it cost to achieve this? We know from our research that these are far from simple questions. There is considerable uncertainty around the extent to which different solutions will impact on disaster risk in locations across the country, and Brendan referred to this as well. This conceptual graph shows the increasing number in blue and costs in orange of disasters over time. Investment in resilience measures is shown in green. We can see in this graph that by 2060, despite growing investment in resilience, we may not have turned around the costs of growing disasters. There is a gap. If we are to know how to make a dent in the spiralling costs of disasters, it would help if we knew what to invest where to make the biggest difference. Even so, we can see it could take some time before these measures affect the cost of recovery, giving us that promised $9.60 return for every dollar spent on risk reduction, which Brendan spoke about. So what can we do to bring that transition point closer? In this regard, transformational solutions could be a game changer. I'm introducing a new line in light blue to represent those transformational solutions. A transformational solution that stops the disaster or reduces its intensity before it hits means that the cost of damage and recovery will be reduced. The transition point, oops, maybe you can see it's the red line. The transition point where costs outweigh benefits would be reached much sooner. Costs will come down because there's much less damage. This is shown by that red arrow, where continued investment in transformational solutions in light blue brings down the costs of disasters in orange. So put your hand up if you understood that graph, because I know. Good, okay, thank you. So in my mind, and Brendan actually referred to this as well, we are preparing to win a war on climate change-fueled disasters. Transformational solutions are a must, because catastrophic disasters are here already, and you only had to look at that graph of Brendan's to get your head around that. And what we're doing is just not working. We need to prepare now so that we can respond to disasters as they intensify even further. We need those options. So what we need to do is understand the hazard and target the intervention accordingly. Advanced science and technological leaps provide us with the ability to do this. We need to treat the root cause and not the symptoms, and we need to think about ways that we can stop disasters in their tracks so that we can stop the costs. So I'm going to talk to you now about 5 transformational solutions that could help us. The first is stopping catastrophic bushfires. The second is stopping cyclones. The third is nature-based solutions for flood mitigation, and we're hoping they can all stop or reduce the hazard. If we want to reduce exposure, our transformational solution that we're working on is relocating communities at risk. And finally, we need to reduce vulnerability. We need to build the capacity of our citizens. So you may know that talking about bushfires first, you may know that 80 to 90% of the burnt area in the 2019-20 bushfires was caused by lightning strikes in remote bushland. Think about that. The problem is no one saw them because they were in remote bushland. And by the time they were large enough to see, it took much too long to get there and they became too large to extinguish. And we saw the 2019-20 bushfire catastrophe. If we could detect and extinguish a small bushfire, a lightning ignition before it spreads, we could prevent catastrophic bushfires. And so we have here a lightning strike, which is hitting bushland. And what we have are really modern technologies that we're developing here, which can detect that ignition in a minute, and new technologies we're developing here, which could extinguish it within 5 minutes. And that is the ANU's aspirational goal with managing catastrophic bushfires and making sure they don't happen in the first place. This animation makes it look really easy to stop catastrophic bushfires. The truth is, it is anything but easy. But my point is that it should be possible. We are doing it. At ANU, we have a Bushfire Research Centre of Excellence, which is supported by Optus and ANU, where ANU researchers from multiple disciplines and sectors are collaborating with industry partners. Advances in areas such as artificial intelligence, sensor technology, drone technology, and engineering have opened up possibilities for interventions that were previously not possible. We're getting there, and with more resources, we would likely get there much more quickly, and I think we need to. It is even more difficult to intervene in cyclones than in bushfires, but again, we are showing that it is possible and that it can be achieved. A cyclone is sensitive to changes in environment and structure. A tiny difference can change its intensity. And what you need to do is identify a highly sensitive point in that cyclone and modify it. ANU is leading an international research team to better understand how we can use aerosols to intervene and stop cyclones or reduce their intensity through cutting-edge physics and modelling. We're also exploring, obviously, those very important social licence and governance issues that come along with this project. I don't know if Lynn's here in the audience, but Lynn is an amazing meteorologist, physicist and modeller, and she has done some amazing work modelling trials of a range of aerosol treatments. And you can see those in the bottom right, which have really had an impact on weakening the cyclone the most. I know some people in the audience will be very sceptical about this stopping cyclones. I can see Andrew Hall smiling. However, believe it or not, in Japan, they are spending the equivalent of 177 million Australian dollars on their moonshot, which is freeing the world from the fear of climate-induced disasters, typhoons and storms. And they're showing a strong interest in collaborating with us because of the work we're doing. In the UK Advanced Research and Invention Agency has a very strong priority on managing our weather through responsible engineering. And China's meteorological master plan, Controlling the Clouds, supports disaster preparedness through large-scale scientific experiment and employs 37,000 people nationwide. Okay, I want to move now to transformational solution number 3, ANU, nature-based solutions for riverine flood mitigation. Nature-based solutions are an alternative to grey infrastructure. So rather than build a large wall, we're going to look at if we can use nature to mitigate against floods. So they're inspired and powered by nature. They address societal challenges such as floods. They provide multiple services and benefits, including biodiversity gain, and they are hopefully of high effectiveness and economic efficiency. At ANU, we're very fortunate to have funding from NEMA and additionally from CSIRO to set up an interdisciplinary team, which is partnering with regional communities across the eastern side of Australia, from Cairns down to Victoria. This research this team, and the partnerships we have ensure that both the flood impacts, ecological benefits, economic, social and institutional issues are all taken into account. We have been really encouraged by a recent retrospective analysis of large-scale ecosystem-based riparian management since the 1980s, done by Kirsty Fryers. Her team found that this seems to be reducing flood flow hydrology at the regional scale in many locations. So what we're trying to work out is, can improved ecosystem management really reduce the risk of floods? And this is what we're exploring in our research with regional communities. And to do that, to start off with, we're doing some very complex flood modelling and then putting nature-based solutions into those models. And I don't know if Mehdi is watching this, but he is, in this case, our star modeller. So here we go. Here is, I won't say where the town is because I haven't asked them if I can use the picture, but here is a large a city in Queensland, which has a major flooding problem. And you can see on that side that those floods are pretty bad. And the dark blue is like a really deep flood of like 5 to 7 meters. And the light blue is a much smaller flood of between 0.2 to 0.6 meters. And so you can see the difference between those two is the difference between having riparian vegetation and some leaky weirs upstream and not having it. So managing your rivers upstream in the whole catchment is extremely important for reducing your flood levels. This is a very big flood, a 1 in a 100-year flood. I'll show you now a slightly smaller flood, but quite a dramatic influence from what we thought was going to be a paleo channel, which is an ancient river channel that's being dug out to divert water away from, this in this case is Moree, but we've modified it quite substantially. And you can see that it actually has reduced the flooding a lot. What is important here are the economics that need to be taken into account that may not make this viable. So one of the best ways to avoid a disaster is to move people out the way. And Naomi, I think, is somewhere here, has been leading an initiative at ANU with some other institutions in the private sector, which shows that a national relocation strategy supported and funded by government should be developed to proactively move at-risk communities out of the way permanently before disasters strike, because they're going to keep striking again and again. This approach would be led by our proposed National Relocation Authority. It would be much more cost-effective than repetitive recovery efforts, reducing the financial burden on homeowners, taxpayers and insurers, as well as that devastating cost of human cost as extreme weather events increase. And finally, I want to talk to you a little bit about building human capacity and capability and the role of citizen scientists in mitigating against floods. So we have a partnership with a community north of Lismore, which aims to strengthen community capacity to understand, prepare for and manage flood risks, increasing the level of scientific literacy within that community. Citizen science empowers communities to actively participate in data collection, monitoring and response efforts, enhancing overall preparedness and resilience. And these citizen scientists are also going to be providing real-time information to authorities, leading to more effective and timely mitigation strategies. We're hoping to obtain funding which allows us to create resource kits that allow this approach to be extended across Australia to all such communities. So we have citizen scientists all over the place mitigating disasters. As Brendan said, a spectrum of disaster management solutions is imperative. We need to invest in future transformational solutions while we continue to invest in disaster readiness and recovery. We need to allocate resources across that spectrum. In a way, we need to break that cycle of spending more on recovery than prevention, but it will take time. So, in my mind, what we need is urgent, coordinated action to develop, fund, and implement transformational disaster solutions. These funding initiatives I'm about to talk about could complement existing programs such as the Disaster Ready Fund, and could also align with existing priority action areas outlined in some state plans. For instance, the New South Wales State Disaster Mitigation Plan, which has recently been launched, has already committed to nature-based solutions and relocation. I propose that we have a national innovation fund for transformational disaster solutions. We have one in defence. We have the Advanced Strategic Capabilities Accelerator in Defence, which is $3.4 billion over 10 years. We have the Defence Science and Technology Group, which is $408 million a year and has 2,200 staff. And here we have those disasters you saw, what Brendan showed you, and we don't have anything like that here. We have Andrew Gissing trying his best to do with the small amount of money he's given to actually save us from disasters. And he needs more, we need more. So how about a National Climate Disaster Fund? I was really interested to read this proposed by the Australia Institute to reduce the burden of response and recovery costs on Australian taxpayers. One of the things they've proposed is redirecting the annual $14.5 billion subsidies for fossil fuel production to disaster mitigation. Well, that's a good idea. Jamie Pittock, who's a researcher here in our Fenner School, has recently released a report that said we need to invest $7.3 billion annually for 30 years in targeted ecosystem restoration. And this could be a way to achieve nature-based solutions for which can affect and impact on our disasters. And I don't know if Elizabeth's here, but there's an organisation which I recently learned about called the Landscape Lab. The Landscape Lab is looking at how we can bundle benefits. So how can we bundle the biodiversity benefits that we get from nature-based solutions together with the flood mitigation benefits, together with the carbon benefits, and you just keep thinking about all those benefits. How can we bundle them together? And what they're doing is convening stakeholders, designing robust catchment plans, and mobilising public and private finance to bundle those benefits. And of course, as I mentioned, we need implementation strategies. We need to develop a national relocation strategy and authority urgently. Kate is soon going to talk to us about public and private partnerships to accelerate innovation and implementation, and I think they're a must. So finally, the costs of natural disasters are immense and growing, with the burden falling on various sectors of society. Addressing this challenge requires a multifaceted approach involving improved resilience, ecosystem restoration, innovative research, transformational solutions, bridging the insurance gap, and decisive government action. Current disaster-related costs far outweigh investment. Think about that. By investing in these areas now, we can potentially reduce the devastating human and economic costs of future disasters. However, the question of who ultimately pays remains a complex and contentious issue that societies must grapple with as the impacts of climate change intensify. And these issues will be explored further today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Roslyn, for that coverage of transformational activities happening in ANU, et cetera, and the rationale for ramping that up. Clearly, we need a lot of change, and we need it very quickly. And an important part of that is industry putting their shoulder to the wheel increasingly. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Kate Simmonds to the floor. Kate's the Senior Advisor for the Investor Group on Climate Change, which has many trillions of dollars in assets amongst the partners of that. She's responsible for uplifting investor understanding in terms of physical risk coming from climate change and for effective adaptations to that. Previously, Kate worked for what used to be Wills Tower Watson. It was on the Insurance Council of Australia's Climate Action Committee and contributed to the Climate Measurement Standards Initiative. Welcome, Kate.
Thanks very much, Mark, and good morning, everyone. So I'm here to talk about the role of institutional investors in funding resilience and adaptation. And And as Mark said, I'm here from the Investor Group on Climate Change. So for those who don't know, the Investor Group on Climate Change is a collaboration of Australian and New Zealand institutional investors who are focused on accelerating investment into a net zero and resilient economy. We have over 100 investor members that represent around $35 trillion worth of assets under management globally, and also have almost 15 million beneficiaries across Australia and New Zealand. In terms of what we actually do, we have 3 core work streams. The first is investor practice, whereby we help our members to manage the risks and opportunities associated with climate change within their own investment portfolios. The second is corporate engagement, where investors engage with the companies that they're invested in on climate-related issues. Climate Action 100+, which you may be familiar with, is one of the key initiatives within that program. And finally, we advocate on behalf of our members for policies that can facilitate action and investment on climate change. So I thought I'd start with takeaways. Conscious that I only have 15 minutes and I think we're already running a little over time. So to begin with, we often talk about physical risk and adaptation for investors and for the finance sector more broadly as a risk, and this is definitely true. However, for investors, it's also a big opportunity. Both Roslyn and Brendan have spoken about the global adaptation finance gap, and historically, as most adaptation has been funded publicly, this means there's a large opportunity for investors to get involved. Investors are aware of this, and the appetite for investors to invest in adaptation and resilience is both significant and increasing. However, there are many different types of adaptation, and Roslyn's already given us some great and very innovative examples, but we don't yet have a clear idea of what counts as adaptation. So investors that are interested in investing in this still are a bit unsure as to where to exactly put their money, and what will, I guess, count in terms of both green finance flows and resilient finance flows. And these different types of adaptation will likely require different types of funding. I've obviously already spoken about private versus public funding, but blended finance, which is a combination of both, is likely to be a very important tool in this area. And these 2 areas that I've just mentioned are sort of the final step, I guess, in bringing private finance into adaptation, which means that they're the areas that probably the least amount of research has been done on, and that needs to change. So just to give an incredibly oversimplified explanation of how physical risk and adaptation is a risk for investors, basically, if physical risk, and that is the physical impacts of climate change, is not adequately adapted to or is maladapted to, this will likely lead to more damage and disruption to assets, to services, to companies, to communities, which then reduces returns on investment. This will then reduce returns to beneficiaries, but also has other implications like reduced investment in high-risk areas and regions, and also the government becoming the investor of last resort. I've included just a few examples of where investors are already beginning to see these impacts impacting their portfolios. And I'd just like to draw your attention to the box at the bottom, which is 2 quotes from the annual reporting of an Australian cement company, whereby in 2020, their earnings were significantly impacted by the 2019-2020 bushfires. This was a one-off, was never going to happen again. And then very quickly after, in 2022, the rain and the floods of that year had a similar impact, showing that extreme weather events are already having a significant impact on both companies and through that on investors. Adaptation as an opportunity for investors. There are a few different ways that we can think about this. The most obvious is that they can fund adaptation. Investors have large amounts of capital that they can provide up front, and that can, in the most simplistic way, be then paid off over a number of years with interest. The other thing that private investors can do is that they can spread risk across both space and time, and also that they can promote competition, which can lead to innovation and efficiency and profit. So I have a couple of examples again on the slide. The first kind of 3 are resilience bonds. So that was that simple example of a debt instrument. And then the last example is an infrastructure example from Australia, where private investment was used to is going to be used to raise the new Brisbane runway 1.5 metres to account for the impacts of climate change. So to help our members to navigate the risks and opportunities associated with physical risk and adaptation, IGCC released its first ever physical risk strategy last August. The vision behind this strategy, and I'm going to slightly read it, is that investors are managing climate change's physical risk by driving urgent economy-wide adaptation and resilience. And there were 4 key objectives that underpin this strategy. So the first was around integrating physical risk and resilience into existing climate change activities. Our investors are already putting large amounts of capital into renewables and other transition infrastructure and technologies. And to quote the Assistant Minister that was here before, we want to make sure that we don't, put things in dumb places. The second is around developer shared understanding. I think somewhat of a theme of adaptation from the presentation so far, and definitely of mine, is around collaboration. But we need to make sure that we're all speaking the same language, which we often aren't. The third is around advocating for investable policy, which is just making sure that the current barriers to the private sector investing in adaptation are removed. And finally, that last step of delivering the necessary private capital. So this was released a year ago. We have 4 ongoing projects on this topic, which are all involving our investor members. We've got one on listed equities, one on infrastructure, one on adaptation financing policies, and one on what a just adaptation looks like. Alongside the strategy, as a kind of evidence that investors are increasingly interested in investing in adaptation and resilience, IGCC recently released our net zero investment survey, whereby interest in physical risk and resilience increased by 20% between the 2022 and the 2023 reports. But we still have this issue that I referred to before as what counts as adaptation. We obviously have there are obviously some clear examples, for example, a levee, a seawall, things that are built. But if you raise a bridge by 1.5 meters, does the whole cost of that bridge count as adaptation financing, or is it just the cost of raising the bridge that counts? When we have examples like Roslyn's mangrove example before, that has other co-benefits. How much of that can be attributed to resilience financing? How much of that is around natural solutions? How much of that is maybe around transition? These are all questions that need to be answered so that investors can know where to put their capital to make sure that both the adaptation is effective, but also that the financing is efficient. So there is a lot of work going on in this space, and I've included a table from the EU taxonomy on the adaptation space. So this just has one of the examples where we have adaptation by an economic activity. So that's an economic activity that creates something that helps someone adapt, but then there's also the economic activity being adapted, and those both require money, but in quite different ways. There are other initiatives that are looking at this currently. So the Climate Bonds Initiative is currently looking at a global framework for what counts as adaptation. But IGCC are also strongly recommending that adaptation be included in the Australian Sustainable Finance Taxonomy. So I also have a spectrum on one of my last slides. So Roslyn and I didn't plan that. And you can also see by this that I'm by no means a graphic designer, so bear with me. So one of the key barriers that we often talk about when we talk about private finance investing in adaptation and resilience is that the benefits are spread across lots of different groups. So the public, different companies, government, and this is often seen as a challenge, and it is, because it makes cost-benefit analysis and investment cases very complex and very difficult to stack up. However, I guess one thing I'd probably like to leave you guys with is that I think this is also a really significant opportunity to move away from the dichotomy of the private sector protects private assets and then the public sector protects public assets, which maybe works okay in theory, but what we're seeing increasingly is that adaptation is complex, it's systemic, and it requires collaboration. So for example, our members have brought up examples where they can invest significant capital to upgrade their assets, but the roads that a government owns that lead to those assets flood, and then the adaptation is basically not worthwhile. So this is a very simplistic, I guess, spectrum of different kinds of financing. So on the left-hand side, going all the way from entirely public to on the right-hand side to entirely private. And along the middle, I've come up with a couple of examples, but I think that there are probably countless examples, and particularly if we then got into the complexity of matching the different types of adaptations, the different types of finance, there are going to be lots of different solutions. And I think that really just highlights the, I guess, contextual nature of adaptation. So on the furthest left, I've got things like government-issued resilience bonds, which I've already mentioned. We then have public-private partnerships, which perhaps are a mix of private and public capital, but maybe relying on some private expertise. And then we have privately funded adaptations that may be incentivized by public initiatives or subsidies, particularly where there's large benefit to the public. And yeah, I'll just, I guess, leave on the takeaways again. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Kate. If our speakers could come and grab a seat for a Q&A. We're running a little bit short of time, but I might cut into 5 minutes of the morning tea if I can. Jerry, should I go there or stay up here?
Entirely up to you, Mark.
I might just stay here, okay. And it just keeps it simple. So just to kick things off, any questions from the audience? We should have some roaming mics. Okay, sitting up there.
Sorry, hand up.
Yes, my name is Rowan Burns. I'm a late career scientist, so I just wanted to ask a question to Kate. Yes, for the IGCC. What I was considering is the complexity of building and adaptation in that concept of the investor growth and commitment to net zero. Has there been any, there's even been talk from DQ, Department of Climate Change, calling for updates on Australian carbon credit unions. So there's obviously concern in the space and movement in the space to some extent, but has the IGCC explored any directions in investing in microclimate development in rural areas and on farms, like the Wikilear concept through the Malloon and other other directions? So I mean, LUCF, I'm not sure everybody knows, land use care forestry is part of emissions reduction. So the development in that area is quite complex. So I just wondered whether you had any thoughts on that one, Kate, trying to keep it simple. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question. The simple answer is no. One of the key challenges for private sector investment in adaptation is scale. So particularly when we're looking at, I guess, sort of micro adaptations, investors, particularly the large institutional investors, kind of don't get out of bed for more than a couple of million, probably more like 50 million. So one of the key things that we are working currently in talks in the government around is, I guess, how particularly the federal government can play almost an aggregation role. So, and this kind of goes to sort of we really are starting to need to get into the mechanics of these kind of financial mechanisms, is that we can't expect every adaptation project to be this perfect investment vehicle. So how can we roll them together into better investment vehicles? How can we, work with the government or local communities so that they can maybe manage it on that local scale, but that the institutional investors can maybe invest in a bond of some kind. Climate Kick did some work a few years ago with NAB and IAG, which looked at, I guess, some of the key barriers to institutional investment in adaptation. And yes, scale and aggregation was one of the key findings, and is still a challenge.
All right. Online.
Do you think it's valuable that the Commonwealth might even look at, as the last resort investor, it might be valuable for the government, the Commonwealth, to actually back those sort of investments if they're actually larger scale?
Yeah, I think, Roslyn sort of brought up the point that we sort of need funds and I guess case studies of things that haven't yet been proven. And you brought up the defence example. I think there's also the example, I've just totally lost the acronym, but there's this the organisation that does sort of emerging renewable technologies. I think we kind of need something for adaptation as well, because it's an area that's really difficult for institutional investors to get into, is that really risky development piece, because they, if you think of a super fund, they have to make certain returns because this is all your retirement funds. And, there are tests which mean that they have to, your future, your super test means that they've got to make certain returns. So they're not incentivized to go for anything that's, I guess, particularly small and risky. So I think that is a role that, the government should play, but should be a collaboration between investors and the government. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. We've got a question up the back, and then I'll take one online.
Hi, I'm Alison Reeve from the Grattan Institute. Thank you both for all three of you for 3 very interesting presentations. This is, I think, for Brendan and maybe Roslyn as well. Some of Roslyn's ideas around transformational prevention absolutely blew my mind. But one of the bear traps in climate mitigation has been that people get too excited about the potential future transformation and forget about the stuff that they can do right now. How do we avoid that when we're talking about adaptation, of people falling into we don't need to worry to change the building code or harden all our existing assets because we're going to have magical cloud seeding in the future?
It's the wisdom of Solomon, that question, isn't it? And that's our real challenge, is how do we deal with legacy risk and keep that focus on dealing with decisions that have been made in the past, but also taking that mid-term to long-term solution. I think it's a blend of both. I quite like the approach that Roslyn brought up, is that at one level, I think that citizen science approach about understanding what communities value and what their priorities are in dealing with legacy risk. So when an event hits a particular community, what are their priorities? What do they want built back? And also, what does it need to look like so that it gives them long-term resilience, so that you can start to build in that adaptation into their decision making. But it also needs to be informed then by all the other players in the system. And that's the reality of the space we're working in. It's a super complex system. You've got the built environment, you've got the natural environment, there's the economy, there's emergency management space. And it's all should be directed at, I think, at ensuring that we've got safe communities, a thriving environment, and also a thriving economy as well. That's what we're trying to achieve. But getting that balance right, I think it's a little bit of having the science paint the picture of our future and getting the balance between what we need to protect and what people value in the past. And that's the super difficult challenge that we're currently dealing with. And we've got, I think, if you look at the work that the Q's starting to do, starting to paint what that picture looks like with the National Climate Risk Assessment. You look at the work that the insurers do in terms of defining risk as we understand it now. That should be starting to inform a lot of the decisions and the policy settings that we need to take into the future.
Yeah, no, I think Brendan's right. We need to invest in all of these areas. I wish we were investing as much as we needed to in some of these transformational solutions. Lynn, I don't know if Lynn's here, but she's recently done some research that showed that we're looking at cyclones by the end of the century, if not sooner, of over 315 kilometres per hour. Think about that strength of wind. And so we need to have options that we're starting to work on now so that when we get these really dramatic kinds of cyclones and other disasters, we're ready for them. I mean, we've already had catastrophic bushfires. The next ones could be worse. We need to be ready for them. It's not that hard, the bushfire project. It just needs the right sort of investment now. When they come, we need to be ready for them. But that doesn't mean that everyone in Australia who lives in a bushfire-prone area shouldn't be having a bushfire-resilient house. We need both. Whatever we do, we're not going to catch everything all of the time. We just need to be as resilient as possible, but also be as prepared as possible with transformational options.
Thanks, Roslyn and Brendan. Really important also to note that today's transformational adaptations are actually tomorrow's incremental adaptations once you actually have made that change. And so we just need to be thinking about how we actually have a portfolio of approaches which do both the incremental and the transformational in a sequential way and make sense in terms of the values that we're trying to protect. If there's any other questions from the audience, yeah, so there's one up the back there and then one there. In the meantime, I'll just ask one from the online. So it's the balance between emission reduction and adaptation. Has the government got it right?
Once again, and I note I've got my colleagues from Prime Minister and Cabinet here, so someone can grab Janet in the at the morning tea section after this. And look, it is about balance. It is about having a portfolio approach to the challenges that we face, and certainly, you know, our focus in the emergency management space, for example, working with all the partners that we do, is very much around integrating disaster management with climate change adaptation, and that's a conversation that has not really become sophisticated, nor is it mature enough in this nation yet. And I was really struck. I went to the South Pacific Leaders Forum back in May in Fiji, and I listened to their conversation about how they integrate climate change adaptation into their emergency management arrangements, and it is very sophisticated. They are facing existential issues in terms of climate change. So adaptation for them is a priority. And we similarly need to lift the profile here in Australia about the requirements for adaptation if we really are going to be a resilient community into the end. Have we got the balance right in terms of emissions reduction? I'll let someone knowledgeable out of DQ maybe answer that one.
I think I just say they're not mutually exclusive, and it's important to not sort of stack them against each other because you miss opportunities for where both can happen at the same time.
I think we need to invest more in adaptation and in disaster mitigation than we are compared to what we're investing in carbon emissions reduction. So if you look at the Energy Transition Authority, I can't remember exactly what the number is, but it's some huge, like $40 billion a year or something, $40 billion, I can't remember. Anyway, they're setting up special authorities now that are dealing with certain elements of the energy transition that are being funded very highly. I think Brendan needs the similar sort of amount, and so does Andrew over here, NR, Natural Hazard Research Australia. We really need to up the amount we're spending because we are also facing an existential crisis. Just remember Brendan's map. I hope that sticks in everyone's mind. That map is going to get worse. We are not reversing climate change. Even if we did stop carbon emissions today, those disasters are going to keep going for a long time and getting worse for a long time. And we're not stopping carbon emissions today. So it's going to get pretty horrible and we need to be prepared for it. And I don't think we're doing enough in that area.
Thanks there. I mean, just a quick reflection on that is that a study from a couple of years ago looking at intergenerational equity issues arising from climate change showed that a child born now would suffer 3 to 4 times on average more climate-related disasters in their lifetime than their grandparents would. And so there's a fundamental intergenerational equity issue that needs to also be thought of here. We've got a question up the back in the middle, and then if we can keep the questions short, okay. Just probably time for 2, and then keep the responses brief as well, just because morning tea calls.
Thank you. Jeremy Mansfield from Green Cross Australia, supporting a locally resilient Australia. Wanted to just reflect on the global cooling movement and the increase of looking at that whole issue of critical infrastructure for cooling and the connection of both mitigation in terms of addressing heat and the impacts of that, as well as not creating a maladaptation scenario of providing, you know, the cooling capacity. And so really drawing a link of, you know, do we really need to keep adaptation separate from the mitigation piece? Because we've been talking adaptation funding for more than a decade that I've been involved with it. And the conversations have been always disconnected from the opportunities that you can do on the one hand to actually reduce the impact of the consequences of heat and other related impacts, and the value that actually brings in terms of that, the capacity to support resilience and adaptation into the future. So there seems to be a very disconnection of that, and well, like, it hasn't served us well. And how do we continue to join the dots? And I agree, the sustainable finance and bringing it closer to into that side of it, but the mitigation versus adaptation has been it has been a poor cousin. And how can we actually draw that closer together so it is valued as part of a longer term solution, rather than seeing as a fix for some part of it, but not included for the other part?
I'll just start with a very quick response, which is that there are definitely some win-wins. So if we look at planting trees for carbon mitigation, they can also provide cooling, and they can also, in some cases, mitigate against floods. So we just need to look for those win-wins, and we need to have the systems in place to capture those benefits so that we can actually go ahead with those kinds of interventions in a way that's funded properly.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you've just said. And I think, I'm not going to say it's simple, but I think it's sort of basically just considering physical risk and adaptation in every place where decarbonisation and transition is considered. I think the other poor cousin is nature, and that's another one that has just a lot of interconnections. And so separating these into 3 separate problems doesn't make a lot of sense, but also they're also complex on themselves, so they are very challenging to deal with together as well.
I note, sorry, Russell, I note Russell Wise is in the audience up here from CSIRO, and that whole notion of value capture and how we start to prioritise and inform the decisions and the choices that we make. I know Russell's done a heap of work here, so maybe you two could connect at some stage here today. But I think it's important, and that is, what do we value? What value do we ascribe to it, and how does that inform our decision-making matrix? And I think as you know, when we start to talk transformation here, that's probably a key skill set that government need to, at all levels, need to start to build greater capability. It's about having that evidence-based network. It's about having a series of frameworks that they can start to make the big choices that need to be made. Because if we look at our current settings in terms of how we invest, if we look in recent history, it's very much being incremental, event-driven. That's changed quite considerably, I think, with the establishment Disaster Ready Fund. We now have a window, a future into the past, and we actually adjust the design parameters accordingly each year. But importantly, I think what we need to mature is that evidence base and those frameworks and those decision points to start to guide that. And as I say, I think Russell's done some fantastic work there. How do we then translate that so that those that are actually seeking to make those decisions can readily access it and have the capabilities to support their decision making? I think that's one of the key capabilities that we haven't really covered off on yet. And on that, I just sort of want to talk briefly, that slide I put up about the 97.3 myth. What we haven't touched here today is about capability. And the whole notion we need to put more money into the system to invest in either mitigation, adaptation, or whatever. If you look at the whole system right now, there's about $28 billion. So that's the recovery, that's also the resilience and risk reduction financing. But if you look at who we are expecting to deliver those projects, their capacity to deliver a program that big is seriously constrained. You look at local government entities, you look at state governments, you look at Commonwealth, you look at the private sector with what's going on elsewhere in the community. I think we need to understand it is a nuanced conversation. I would suggest, and I'm happy to have this debate outside during morning tea, Mark, is that there is enough funding in the system right now. There is so much, we can't deliver it quickly enough. And we're also in this constant space of recovery and reconstruction so that our capacity to do the delivery of big mitigation projects, undertake big adaptation projects is seriously constrained. But we need a transformational approach because we don't see it getting any better in the short term. And we need stronger partnerships with the private sector potentially to start to deliver some of those big projects.
Thanks, Brendan. We're all in it together, I guess, is the summary. And one last question up the back, if you can keep it brief and brief.
Yes, I'll keep this very brief because I'm very hungry as well. I'm Chris from Department of Climate Change. I just wanted to address your suggestion, Roslyn, in regard to transformational change. Community relocation, how do you suggest supporting traditional owners and First Nations peoples who've really got those close ties to the land? And is relocation an actual solution to mitigating their losses?
Yeah, it's a very, very tough question and something that we have discussed a great deal. And so most countries that are looking at relocation now, particularly say in the South Pacific, in the US and Canada, it is often the Indigenous people that are having to move, and it's very difficult. The big issue that we have really highlighted in the work we're doing on relocation is consultation. And so we can't do anything without really having those conversations with the communities involved, whether they be Indigenous or otherwise. The reality is that there are some places that are just going to not be livable into the future. And if we look at the Pacific now, we can see what's happening there. It's starting to happen in our own country, and we need to be prepared for it. And Indigenous people are in the front line in some cases, and we just need to start to have those conversations and see how we can work through this in the best possible way and provide the amount of support that they need to do this in a dignified way.
So we'll just call this session to a close. I'd just like to thank all of the speakers. It has been a great session.